This is a Rusty Family 8 combination of lines, loops, and rolls. This family combines a variety of elements into some interesting figures for scale aerobatics. Some are quite familiar, and others not so much. They include single and double Humpties, 5/8 looping figures, P-loops, Q-loops, and 1 1/4 loops. As might be expected, this family shares many of the same judging criteria as families 1 and 7. Here are some general criteria common to all figures included in Family 8. Loop size is not judged. The looping portions may be drawn as large or small as the pilot chooses. The radii of all partial loop portions must be constant. Each variation or flat spot observed is downgraded by 1 point. In figures where partial loop radii are required to be equal, 1 point is deducted for each mismatch. The standard is the first partial loop in the figure. Roll elements can be added on interior lines and must be centered. A deduction of 1 to 4 points is required using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a reference. If rolling elements are added at the entry or exit of the figure, there must be no line between the roll and the loop. Such a line would require a minimum 2-point downgrade. In addition, the roll and loop must be distinct, not allowing any overlap in these portions of the figure. Any overlap should be downgraded at 1/2 point per 5 degrees. These are examples of Humpty bumps. They can be single, either vertical or diagonal, or double and may be flown either up or down. The double Humpty judging criteria is largely the same as for single Humpties, and so will be covered here. The entry and exit partial loop radii, marked A and C on Figure 46, don't have to match. As with all radii, however, they must be smooth and constant with all standard looping rules applied. Along with the entry and exit radii, the half loop, marked B on Figure 46, must be a smooth, constant radius. In the case of a double Humpty where there are 2 half loops, neither of those radii need match. The altitude of the figure and the length of the up and down lines are chosen by the pilot and are not judging criteria. As a result, the entry and exit altitudes don't need to be the same. Any rolls that may be included on the interior lines must be centered with equal line segments before and after. A deduction of 1 to 4 points is applied using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1. The vertical and 45-degree lines are judged on proper track relative to the true horizon, with deductions of 1/2 point per 5 degrees of deviation. Here are reverse half cubans, shown in Figure 1, and half cubans in Figure 2. These figures consist of a 1/8 entry or exit loop and a 5/8 loop connected by a 45-degree line. The radii on the part loops do not have to match, however all the standard looping rules apply. Rolling elements can be placed on the 45-degree line, and if present must be centered. Deductions range from 1 to 4 points using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a reference. The track of all lines is judged relative to the true horizon, and deviations are penalized at 1/2 point per 5 degrees. In addition to rolls on the 45 line, there may be rolling elements on the entry or exit line. If rolls are present here, there must be no line drawn between the loop and the roll. Any visible line results in a minimum 2-point deduction. At the judge's discretion, a 0 could be scored. The roll element and the partial loop element may not overlap. The downgrade is 1/2 point per 5 degrees. Since line length and partial loop size are up to the pilot, the entry and exit altitude may be different with no penalty. Here are some of the many variations of the vertical 5/8 loop shown in Figure 1 and the reverse 5/8 loop in Figure 2, both commonly referred to as a teardrop. These figures contain a 5/8 loop, a quarter loop, and 2 lines. The entry or exit may either be a 1/8 or a 3/8 loop. As shown in Figure 48, none of the partial loop radii need match. However, they must be smooth and constant. All of the standard looping rules apply. Rolls may be added to either or both of the 45 and 90 degree interior lines. If present, rolls must be centered with 1 to 4 points deducted for deviation. Use Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a reference. The track of both lines are judged with reference to the true horizon and are deducted at 1/2 point per 5 degrees. Since the line lengths and radii need not match, the entry and exit altitudes may be different with no penalty. Here are some examples of P-loops consisting of a 1/4 and 3/4 partial loop connected with a line. Note that the 3/4 loop ends before intersecting with the vertical line as shown in Figure 1 by the half roll and in Figure 2 by the blue lines. The radii of the 1/4 and 3/4 partial loops do not have to match, but must be smooth and constant, observing all the standard looping rules. Roll elements may be added on the vertical line and must be centered. As usual, the deduction is 1 to 4 points using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a reference. Rolling elements may also be added to a horizontal entry or exit line. If present, there can be no line drawn between the loop and the rolling element. At least 2 points must be deducted if a line is shown and could be scored a 0 at the discretion of the judges. Next are some reversing P-loops. This figure is made of 2 quarter loops, 1 1/2 loop, and 1 connecting line. One of the quarter loops and the half loop are joined, marked A and B on Figure 49, and these are required to have the same radii. The standard is set by the radius of the first joined loop. If they are not drawn equally, there is a 1-point deduction. For these joined loops, the pilot must finish the first loop and immediately begin the second partial loop. There can be no line drawn between the joined loops, with a minimum deduction of 2 points. The radius of the entry or exit quarter loop, marked C on Figure 49, does not have to match that of the joined loops, but must observe all the standard looping rules. If there are rolling elements on the horizontal line, there may be no line drawn between the partial loop and the roll. A minimum of 2 points is deducted if shown and could be zeroed. In addition, the roll and the loop may not overlap, 1/2 point per 5 degrees if they do. Rolls could also be placed on the vertical line and, if present, must be centered. Deductions of 1 to 4 points apply using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a guide. Here are some 7/8 loop figures, commonly referred to as Q-loops, consisting of a 1/8 loop, a 7/8 loop, and a 45-degree line. As indicated, these figures can be flown up or down, upright or inverted. The radii of the partial loops in these figures need not match. They are subject to all the standard looping rules. As indicated in Figure 2, rolls may be placed on the 45-degree line and, if present, must be centered. The downgrade for misplaced rolls are between 1 and 4 points using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a reference. Rolls may also be integrated into the loop itself and are centered at the top or bottom of the loop. These centered rolls are deducted at 1/2 point per 5 degrees of offset. In addition, as for all integrated rolls, they must follow the radius of the loop. If drawn on a line, there is a deduction of 2 points. Finally, rolling elements may be placed on the entry or exit line. If rolling elements are specified, there must be no visible line drawn between the rolling and looping portions of the figure. A minimum downgrade of 2 points is assessed and may be zeroed at the judge's discretion. In addition, the roll and loop may not overlap each other. If they do overlap, a deduction of 1/2 point per 5 degrees is applied. The final group of figures is the 1 1/4 reversing loops. This group contains 3 loops, one each of a 3/4, 1/2, and 1/4 loop, and 1 vertical line. The 3/4 and 1/2 partial loops are joined, requiring the pilot to begin the 1/2 loop immediately after completing the 3/4 loop. Should there be a line drawn between the joined loops, a minimum 2-point deduction is applied. The pilot must also make the radii of the loops the same. If they are not, the score is reduced by 1 point. For the 1/4 exit loop, the radius need not match that of the joined loops. However, all the standard looping rules apply. As shown on Figures 1 and 2, rolling elements can be placed on the horizontal entry line, and if present, there can be no visible line drawn between the roll and the loop. A minimum of 2 points is deducted for a visible line and could be zeroed at the judge's discretion. Any roll elements placed on the vertical line must be centered. Deductions of 1 to 4 points apply using Figure 14 in Rule 7.1 as a guide. This concludes Aresti Family 8, combination of lines, loops, and rolls. For more information, log on to mini-iac.com or arestisystem.com.